Okay, welcome to this workshop organized by YouGovern and more specifically by João, Ebru, and Tania. This is one of our more content-related sessions, and we are very happy to have you here and use a lot of time to actually discuss. So I think João will introduce the topic, so unless there's anything else, I think we can dive right in. If you happen to be on social media, feel free to post and share the event so we work on our outward appearance. And also if there's a volunteer for writing a blog post other than, of course, João, Ebru, and Tania, just with reflections, that would be very much welcome. So please reach out to Andre or myself. Yes, so the floor is yours, João.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. So first of all, thanks all of you for joining us for this YouGovern workshop, which we have titled Urban Governance in the Peripheries. I'm João Tonucci, and I'd like to first of all thank Ebru and Tania for getting together to develop this workshop over the last months, and also Sarah, Andre, and Tuna for all the support they gave us. I will start by giving a more like a brief conceptual introduction of what we have in mind for today. And then I will hand over to Tania to her first presentation. And after the three presentations, we're gonna have like three case studies, Tania, Ebru, and myself. We're gonna have a kind of a discussion, a brainstorm discussion, breakout rooms, and then we come back to discuss it. But so for the sake of start, I will just briefly mention that the notion of urban governance is nowadays widely used to refer to practices, principles, institutional arrangements that coordinate and regulate planning, management, and development of urban spaces. Its rise is often associated with the weakening of centralized state-led urban planning and its replacement by some forms of neoliberal states which governs cities through complex arrangements involving private and civil society actors. So we know that current approaches to urban governance, often originated in northern contexts, tend to focus on institutionalized actors and formal processes. In contrast, our idea is that this workshop explores governance in and from the peripheries, in line with recent calls to decenter urban studies and to acknowledge a set of actors, spaces, and processes often relegated to the geographical and theoretical periphery. In that sense, we are very much interested in problematizing the notion of the periphery beyond also its common sense association with the global south or only with auto-constructed informal settlements. We also aim to understand how and by whom the urban is governed when the states and other formal actors are not fully present or do not assume their designated roles across the north and south divides. So thinking beyond traditional institutional arrangements, we think opens up a space to consider usually overlooked and understudied actors and logics that operate in those contexts and try to understand how they interact or conflict with more visible, formalized governance arrangements. So by exploring cases from Mexico, Turkey, and Brazil, this workshop aims to compare common and divergent features of governance in the peripheries. So we have a lot of questions behind this. So how do we put forward and compare this distinctive process across different contexts? What kind of transformative trajectories, such as breaking points, critical events, or junctures, lead governance processes and arrangements to emerge in the margins as distinct from one another? This leading question will guide all of us, the participants, to examine their own peripheral governance contexts and to explore factors and conditions that have led to the current state of affairs. The approach we seek is to provide deeper insights into these diverse governance processes and trajectories shaping peripheries. We also want to stimulate a reflection across different geographies on what can be generally learned from more flexible, enabling, and solution-oriented governance practices emerging in the periphery. So that's the main outline, the ideas we kind of put together to stimulate this discussion. This is not a closed text. This is just an orientation of questions that we are very much interested in hearing back from you. So the idea is that we have these small, brief presentations of case studies. We're not gonna dive deep into any of them. It's just for them to serve as examples of governance in the peripheries and on the varieties of process actors and institutional arrangements we have been finding in our own researches. And we are sure all of you might experience or know something related and similar. So before I hand over to Tania, I'd like just to pose the question that is gonna be guiding this workshop that should be behind our minds all the time. Is that what factors affect the functioning and transformation of the current peripheral urban governance context you experience or are familiar with, and how? So this is the main question. I will go back to it after my presentation and before we open the room for everyone to discuss. Thanks very much. I think with this brief introduction, I will hand over to Tania. The floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, thank you, João. Let me share my screen. 1 second. Yeah, do you see my screen? I think. Oh, wait. Do you see my presentation? Or is it? Can you see my presentation, João?
Yeah, it is your presentation.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Let me just put it in. Is it full screen? I don't really see if it's in full screen. Well, it doesn't matter. I can see.
It's good.
It's good. Okay, good. Yeah, so yes, I will be talking today about research I conducted, and I really apologize for the background noise, but I'll try to do this in 10 minutes, but okay. Yeah, so this is part of my PhD research that I conducted at University College London. Since then, I actually moved to the Netherlands and actually I left academia and I work now as a regional planner at the province North Holland. So it's a bit of a different context now, but I'm still trying to keep that bridge with academia, and this is one of my attempts. So yeah. And also quite challenging to keep it in 10 minutes, but yeah, that's what we're here for. So let's give it a go. We also decided that in order to create kind of a common language, we are going to start with kind of our own definition of peripheral of peripheries, and we will end at the end with a reflection of how which factors have affected the current urban structures in our peripheries and urban governance structures. Sorry. So for me, I use the definition of Teresa Caldera of peripheral urbanization as something that does not refer to a spatial location in the city, usually at its margins, but actually more as a way of producing space that can be found anywhere. And this actually useful, this non-spatial definition is quite useful because in one hand, it refers to what we usually understand by peripheries as zones where you have I don't know, self-built settlements, but it also adapted well to transformations in the current urban peripheries, where we see new models of urbanization emerging that are still quite that we can still classify as peripheral urbanization. In the case of Mexico, these are, there was a kind of transformation in the affordable housing options in the peripheries. And this went from a self-built or largely self-built housing to more affordable, privately developed, newly built housing units that is largely subsidized by the state. It's not that the formal or this kind of formal option of housing replace the other, but they are now kind of competing in the space in the peripheries. And what I find interesting of the definition of peripheries in non-spatial ways is that I can also translate that beyond this physical periphery, and I will come back to that later when I use the term peripheral planning. So interesting seeing how planning has responded to this transformation in the peripheries. And just to provide a bit of context of the housing policies in Mexico, we see throughout the years a shift in the role that the state played from a more centralized position where the state was involved in the production of housing and building housing for building social housing in the 70s to a more absence of the state, a more like detached role of the state during the 90s and until the early 2010s, when basically the market was open to many other products that created a more neoliberal housing market. And this story has happened in many places and certainly in countries like Mexico, Turkey, and Brazil. But what I found interesting in Mexico was that in after 2010, there was kind of a introduction of a new policy in Mexico that contradicted a little bit this neoliberal logic, because it was a more a more centralized position. A more centralized position of the state, where actually, instead of allowing these kind of developments of social housing developments happening anywhere, they provided some restriction on the location of these developments. So this is actually my case study. It's the urban containment perimeters. It's a federal policy applied to more than 300 cities in Mexico. And what is interesting of this policy is that it is a housing policy, but it really affects urban planning because it uses financial incentives. So basically what the policy does is that they limits the locations where they could apply a subsidy for affordable housing to certain areas that are closer to urban settlements. So at least what the state tried to do is to kind of restrict the areas of expansion, because our cities were expanding because of that housing model. Okay, so what I find really interesting is to look at this policy from two perspectives. And if you look at it as a housing policy, it falls in that kind of line of political economy, and then kind of is very low. Yeah, you could see the policy as something that simply allows the liberal model to continue, because it kind of create some limits for the system, because it was a lot of negative externalities of the previous model. But anyways, what I found most interesting is to look at it actually from a planning perspective, because especially in contexts like Mexico, where our conventional planning instruments are really outdated, they are depending on still on very much master planning and zoning. They're not really being effective, and they're just basically they're just being created, but they're not implemented usually. And this is partly because of our governance structure. So in theory, we have a very hierarchical governance structure in urban planning, where you have the state, the federal state, then we have the federation, let's say, then the state, and then the municipalities. And in theory, the municipalities are the ones implementing urban planning, but they're still very dependent on the federal budget. So this creates an incomplete decentralization process, and that kind of impedes the implementation of urban planning, but that precisely allowed the implementation of alternative policies, such as the urban containment policies. So I read this policy as peripheral planning, and I found it quite interesting because it uses this financial component and introduced it to urban planning, recognizing that finance has kind of this type of housing model is one of the main driving forces of urbanization. On the other hand, it affected the government structures because, this is a very top-down approach with practically no negotiation with the local governments, but a lot of negotiation with private developers. Basically, the federal government and the developers together defined these boundaries. So you can imagine that a lot of the developers, push to expand the boundaries for the subsidy to incorporate their land. So that was that's kind of the downside of the policy. And also an important part is that it shows how access to information affects knowledge production. So I was interviewing a lot of the officials in municipalities to know how aware they were from about this policy and whether or not they have used it. And most of them, they didn't know even that existed. So that was that also plays a role, that there are policies implemented at a federal level that could have potentially a lot of implications on the way of urban development. But most municipalities were not aware. But some of them, they did know about the policy and use it for their benefits. Okay, and just to close down, because this is getting very loud. Sorry. Looking at the urban containment policies as peripheral planning allows us to understand emergent ways of responding to recent transformations of peripheral urbanization processes. And going back to the question that João mentioned earlier, how were the current structures affected, or which factors affected the governance structures? In this case, it was political economy factors, the neoliberalization of the housing market, the uneven or incomplete decentralization process, and access to information and the presence of entrepreneurial actors. I hope you could understand most of it, besides the side notes, but that was my presentation. Now stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Tania, and for keeping on time.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So with this, I think I will invite Ebru for her presentation on Turkey.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. And in this workshop, as João already outlined nicely, and Tania made an amazing performance, really, we will basically be exploring the question of what factors affect the functioning of the current urban governance context. And to find some answers, we will share the context we are familiar with, as João mentioned. And at the end of the session, our presentations, we would like to hear your experiences and make a discussion on it. And as a researcher with Turkish background, I will try to share some insights from Istanbul. And I will also refer to our latest work, which is quite relatable with this topic as well. But before delving into details and looking how it works in Turkish context, I wanted to start with basics. What is gecekondu? This word is Turkish itself, but it is used as it is, also in English-based literature, and it actually forms of two separate words. Gece and kondu means built at night as quickly as possible, and since it was put up very quickly, it is without proper permissions and it is informal. And these homes were constructed by residents themselves who migrated from rural areas of Turkey to urban centers in Turkey. And why do we call these areas as peripheries? Like from a design-wise perspective, peripheries are described kind of outskirts of cities located at the edges of city, as you know. But in gecekondu case, they were once located at the peripheral areas of the city, yes. But now they are at the very center, very heart of the city, and very accessible to main access. And the cost of the lands they have been built on is quite high right now. So the reason why we call these areas as peripheries or left behind, as we named in our work, is now about the processes. And one of my professors from Istanbul Technical University makes a statement to an article published in Bloomberg and saying that gecekondu is something so tied to the history of urbanization in Turkey. And you cannot think the building apart from the process itself. And since the city has evolved, the process has been evolved process is evolving as well. As I said, processes are so decisive on transformation of these areas. And in our work with Professor Tuna, we analyzed Istanbul's urban development trajectory within entrepreneurial governance framework. And we found how these peripheral areas turn into opportunity zones for redevelopment within these development models. And our work has also discovered that these peripheral areas are full of unexpectedness. And because they have been marginalized, mostly on purpose, and they have been left behind, and also because of all these unpredictable results of institutional transformations, flexible regulatory practices, specifically within an authoritarian state context, all these lead to some interesting and unexpected outcomes. So we discuss in this research that path-breaking trajectories occur in distinct ways, depending on the adaptive capacity of urban communities, flexibility in planning regulations, and while doing so, we focus on squatter, gecekondu areas in Istanbul, and we map out these path-breaking trajectories by considering institutional context, policy context, societal responses as well. Well, first of all, I wanted to provide some input regarding mega projects, mega practices in Istanbul through these maps that I created based on my fieldwork. And figure 1 shows a total of 128 large-scale projects whose types vary from transportation to large-scale infrastructure, so on. And this figure shows how mega projects sprawled over the city and beyond its boundaries by bulldozing the existing urban tissue, of course. And figure 2 shows a total of 16 regeneration initiatives out of those 128 projects. And the table here indicates the analytical framework we created to examine all these 16 regeneration projects through their time periods, legislative diversity, transformation framework. For this published article, we analyzed Derbent and Fikirtepe cases, but in this presentation, I will go with another case called Ok Meydanı, which is also a gecekondu area. And if you would like to learn more specifically on Fikirtepe and Derbent cases, you can visit our work via this QR code here. And before moving on Ok Meydanı case, I will be sharing 2 more slides to give an idea of what the urban development path of Istanbul and Turkey in general look like. This linear timeline provides a quick look on what happened in this around 20 years. And whole story has started in 2002. AKP was selected as ruling party. The party's agenda was to promote economic growth, social equality, justice by implementing urban regeneration as a government policy. So they developed this comprehensive legal and institutional framework that was previously lacking in the country. And followingly, they announced many large-scale projects, but also created many flexibilities by inventing regulations and even institutions. Of course, however, it doesn't follow like this straightforward or linear path as you see here. Instead, it involves like complex narratives and critical junctures, as I show here in this figure. As a consequence of the establishment of new institutions within new regulations, this analysis shows how legal and institutional restructuring creates these critical junctures. And very shortly, how we created this path elaboration. It is based on a quantitative scoring method. We considered here the creative and destructive impacts of large-scale projects, and accordingly, we ran the analysis over 2 basic trajectories. Expected and unexpected development trajectories. The expected path, the one on the top, reflects a scenario in which all large-scale regeneration projects and relevant institutional regulations end up with creative impacts in this development trajectory. And the unexpected trajectory, again, start with the same line, but the one with orange dots on black line demonstrate the realized impacts of the projects and regulations by also considering the effects of critical junctures as well as unexpected impacts of path-breaking trajectories, which consist of all centralization story, like granting authorities to upper scales, Gezi Park protests, and shift to presidential system and so on. I don't want to exceed the time. So as a consequence of this detailed analysis of about 20-year development trajectory, we deconstructed 3 path-breaking trajectories. Authoritarian entrepreneurial governance is the first. The second is over-regulated and flexible urban planning trajectory. And the third one, institutionalization of self-organization. And in the case of Ok Meydan's story, I will try to tell a little bit how these trajectories occur in peripheral areas. So, historical development of this area dates earlier than 1950s, where big migration flows in Turkey have started. And to briefly touch upon, Ottoman Empire accept refugees due to Balkan Wars around 1912. Albanians come here and they farm vegetable gardens in Ok Meydan in early 20th century. In other words, Albanian refugees have started to use these charity lands with different functions in that time. Followingly, with the big flow starting in 1950s, it's clearly and strikingly visible, you can check the photos, how rapid urbanization and unplanned, uncontrolled settling caused irreversible changes in urban lands. But what is important to highlight here is that the legal status of the land belongs to the charity. And plus, in 1961, High Commission of All Real Estates and Monuments defined the borders of historical area in Ok Meydanı. Yes, this area has also a historical conservation area because they wanted to prevent these new settlements and to protect the historical part of it. And a long process in terms of overlapping institutional borders, jurisdictional conflicts right after, legal status of lands, informal housing issues follow this complex process. And the question is, how path-breaking trajectories occur here? In 2012, where the government policies have turned into highly centralized ones, this area was announced as a transformation zone. Followingly, entrepreneurial activities have come to the stage. Large-scale, private sector-driven and only profit-driven projects were planned here, as you can imagine, by disregarding the historical existence of the area's conservation borders, diversified structure of the communities there. And then authoritarian interventions follow these planning processes. People living in this area, the squatter areas, took the streets, protested the state's aggressive interventions. Also to refer how self-organization of communities make difference in processes and create unexpectedness. It's important to highlight that the social structure of this neighborhood is quite diversified and because of that also fragile. But evidences like interviews show that there have been quite established and active organizations here. They are a few though, yet they managed to organize themselves to make their voice heard and their existence visible. And the latest situation of this regeneration initiative is still in progress because now also residents are kind of trying to negotiate with the state by replicating state's entrepreneurial approach as well. And to wrap up, it's important to define the factors affecting how an urban governance approach works in a particular context. In Turkish case, urban entrepreneurialism turns into authoritarian entrepreneurial governance through the state's over-centralized policies, which brings speculations, unreasonable decisions, and flexibilities, which create conflicts and even over-regulations with it. And as a consequence, communities look for innovative ways to represent themselves in these negotiations and also be part of these policy-making networks. Yeah, that's all what I want to share. Hope you enjoy listening, and I would like to say I'm so happy. Thanks to this event, we had a really nice connection with my colleagues, João and Tania, and I hope we will carry this collaboration a step forward. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Ebru. I'll try to share my screen now.
I hope I was on time. I wasn't aware of that. Sorry if I'm.
Yeah, that's all right. 1 second. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
So, hi everyone again, and thanks very much for joining in. I mean, first thing I'd like to say is that in contrast to Ebru's and Tania's presentations, this is a very much ongoing project. This is a new project that I started last year, where I'm looking at major regulatory changes and the effects of the changes that have been going on over the last 5 years in the governance of land regularization in Brazil, but specifically looking through a very which is the case of Agua Limpa. So it will be a little bit different as I'm looking at something that's still pretty much going on and that I'm starting what might take like a 5-year project to complete. So I think the first general idea is to recognize there is the problem of widespread urban land informality in Brazil. This has been dealt with by the state since the 70s through broad urban legal order to recognize and regularize informal settlements instead of eviction, which was the previous approach. This has been enshrined in the progressive and now famous City Institute of 2001 and Law 11977 of 2009 that put together a comprehensive land regularization approach, which puts together urbanization and tenere security as the main focus. This has all been challenged by a new law that came into effect in 2017 in part of a major neoliberal land reform, which put much more focus on regularization by private actors, not by the state, and the focus on individual titling and not exactly on comprehensive land regularization as was before. So I'm looking at this case, the Nosso Agua Limpa project, as a kind of an entry point for understanding what are the effects of this new land framework, and are we seeing something that is a shift from public-led to market-led governance of land regularization, and what are the outcomes of that? So first, I would want to say a few words on the shift in regulations. We had this previous legislation of 2009, which was an extensive regulation on full land regularization, as I said before, pretty much focused on the idea of right to housing, social function of property. But there was this major political and economic change in 2016, which came into effect into this new law 13465 under this new conservative neoliberal governance. And this law follows the Hernando de Soto model, which was adopted in Peru, and also the land governance framework put forward by the World Bank, which focus on full property rights through individual titling. It also creates new possibilities of expanding regularization beyond the urban core through the legalization of elite kinds of informalities, such as gated communities and irregular rural subdivisions. But more interesting for me, it creates the space for private agents to promote regularization instead of the state. So there is this new market for regularization, bringing together very interested parties such as notaries, consulting firms, georeferences, and engineering companies, and also financial institutions. And this also brings to the point the idea that one of the reasons of this law is to create conditions to advance land financiarization through the use of the titled properties as collateral for extending new forms of debt to low-income families. These new markets have been accompanied by new governance arrangements, you can imagine. So there's a proliferation of different forms of private-public partnerships at all levels, and I'm looking at specifically at one of them, which is the Agua Limpa case. Where and what is Água Limpa? So Água Limpa is this large informal settlements in the margins of the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte, where I am settled right now. It's spread over 2 different municipalities. It had its origins in a project to create a kind of an elite suburb, a large subdivision that never really took off. This place was kind of abandoned for more than 40 years. But in the last 20 years, it became a hotspot of gated communities, a huge Coca-Cola factory, and also mining activities, which created a new wave of land invasions led by land swindlers and trying to provide land and housing for working class families moving to this place, which also accompanied by the growth of informal land markets. So now we have this large settlement with more than 10,000 people, mostly of low-income families. It resembles a lot of Teresa's Caldeira idea of peripheral urbanization. It's auto-constructed, mostly poor infrastructure. Owners and residents lack proper title deeds, environmental risks of all sorts. And a community association was created in 2006 to fight against those situations. But so far, this place has been known as experiencing extremely rapid growth, land conflicts, various different layers of informality, not only land informality, illegal markets, and also all different kinds of overlapping regulations. Just a few pictures of this rapid change. On the left, we have what it was in 2006 and what it is like 15 years ahead. So, and now it is still growing on, especially in the second municipality of Itabirito. This is what this place was supposed to be in the 50s and 60s. It was supposed to be a wealthy recreational area and a kind of a suburban subdivision for the Belo Horizonte middle class and elite. But this is how it turned out, right? It never happened as it should. It was implemented as approved. So there are these different layers of informality and this new wave of occupation by low-income families with different kinds of land mafias and land groups operating to distribute lands to these people. So in light of this very complicated and conflictual situation, in 2008, there was the start of this project called REURB, Nosso Água Limpa, which is this right now one of the largest and most complex urban land regularization projects going on not only in Brazil, but also in Latin America. It had its origins in a kind of conduct adjustment term, which is a legal instrument used in Brazil to deal with this kind of complicated conflicts, getting together the public ministries, the city councils, the city halls of the 2 municipalities, and also the residents association. However, this process was originally led by a company, a Terra Nova company, which is a company, a so-called social enterprise of specialized in human resettlement and regularization, coming from the south of Brazil. It's a huge company which has a lot of direct interests in expanding this regularization market. So the process has been led by this company, and the company has been appointed as the one responsible for putting this process together. The regularization of this area is kind of split between 2 modalities. One is called REURB-S, which is focused on social interests, especially on very low-income families, which is funded by the municipalities. But the most part of it was classified as a kind of specific one, which is paid by individual beneficiaries. So people living on the ground, so people living on those plots, informal plots of land, will have to pay for the urbanization and for receiving the titles. And a large sum of that money goes to this regularization company. The governance arrangement of this process, which for me is very interesting as we are discussing governance here, created this project management committee, including the city halls, resident associations, because there are more than one, municipal housing councils, the owners associations, which has a different view of the process, business owners, and also the regularization company itself. So it's a very complicated structure. They have to meet every once in a month and have a lot of different responsibilities over this, which will take at least 5 to 10 years process to complete in their own terms. So what has happened so far? So there has been some state provision of infrastructure and also social facilities such as schools, hospitals. A few contracts with residents have been signed by the company, but not most of them. However, we have we're kind of looking at very different forms of conflicts arising. First, between resident associations. So there is one resident association that is against the process and the other one is part of the process. And also a conflict between the two municipalities. And what happened a few years ago, one of the municipalities left the agreement and may stroke a deal with a different company, which created a more complex situation right now as we have two different processes running together. Also, the regularization enters in conflict, sometimes violent conflict, with illegal markets that are established in this place, like land markets, energy market, water market, and of course the drug markets. The regularization process has sparked interest in absent owners and also on new investors. So we have been seeing a kind of a new wave of land speculation, and land values since 2018 have risen by multiplied by more than 4 times in some cases. And also lack of interest of municipalities to proceed with regularization of social interests. So as a kind of very provisory conclusion, what we have been seeing is the establishment of a gray zone between state, market, and society. This clash between the idea of regularization as a collective social right on one hand, on the other, informality as a source of market opportunities for these new markets, for these new companies, and a complex market-led governance of regularization, which on one hand is more flexible. It speeds up the process, what we call a fast-track regularization, but it's also conflict-ridden and in many cases pretty much unfair in terms of who is paying for this process. So I just wanted to give this broad overview of this story, an ongoing story, and then I'll finish with this general question that will serve from now on as the framework for our discussion. We're coming back to it. So what factors affect the functioning and transformation of the current peripheral urban governance context you experience or are familiar with, and how? So I'll stop sharing from here. Thank you.
And I guess we will have this 1 minute we will take this 1 minute, all of us, to think of it. Then I will try to create this breakout rooms for 2 participants, or yeah, the one room will be 3, I guess. We will brainstorm on this question and we'll try to generate some reflections over our experiences, our insights, observations for 15 minutes. Then we will come back for a round table discussion. I think all participants were invited to join their breakout rooms.
Hello.
Hey.
Sorry.
Hello.
I hope everything is going well.
I cannot see you, Zeynep. Okay, now I can. Yeah, hi.
Can you hear? Yes, hello.
Yeah, but your camera is off, I guess, right?
Yes,
Or
because
is okay. No worries.
I was outside.
And are
Hello?
Why are we 40?
Yeah, are we 4?
Okay, then I should make another breakout
I was
room.
gonna say that I won't be able to join the breakout rooms because I need to leave the workshop for something else.
Ah, okay. No worries then.
Okay,
Then you
I could
you
go
are
into
leaving.
Anna's. Do you want me to go into Anna's? Because she was with Zainab, so I could
Okay.
join
Okay,
Anna's.
of course, yeah.
Okay.
You are welcome to go there.
Okay.
See you.
Rooms are recorded. It feels like very Big Brother-ish. Or how's it going?
Good.
Zainab had to leave and she was in yours, and I was like, oh, I might as well go into yours. I was gonna message you too during the presentations, but I figured I'd be a good host. How's it going?
Good. I'm hoping to meet Annabelle on Sunday.
Oh, you're meeting her this Sunday?
I think so.
She's supposed
I'm
to
not
be
quite
like
sure.
writing. She's like she has like a lecture next week that she hasn't prepared for at all too. So she's just procrastinating now.
Okay.
I see her plan.
Well, I don't know. Maybe there's going to be a text on Sunday like, oh, I can't.
No, she's pretty good. Like if she's actually, I don't think she's ever canceled plans with me.
Okay. No, it's awesome here. I'm struggling to get my data. But I'm like not struggling to the point where I'm like, oh, struggling, but I feel like I'm trying to find like the perfect thing, and I just have to kind of start and just go for it, and then it's going to be fine. But I just have this, I'm just like, one step before it. But I have my first like interview that I'm going to record probably and transcribe on next week, Friday. So that's good. Yes. And I
That's
still have
already starting. It's only October.
Yeah.
You still have like 3 months, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, but it's just, there's so much this fucking city is so huge.
Yeah, it's really big. Amsterdam feels like a small little like town compared to Paris for sure. It's a big difference. Wow.
No, but it's also fascinating. Like so much.
Are you comparing to Amsterdam? Did you figure out what your comparison's going to be?
So I have I was looking at like also a bit like larger redevelopment areas here, such as the Amsterdam North. So something that's like a bigger area that's supposedly developed as a whole. I mean, Amsterdam North doesn't have a master plan, whatever, but it's still like this cohesive area they kind of decided to like redo. And then first I started off by thinking this one specific element, and then also classes started and the lectures are really nice, and I realized, okay, this is, I mean, not that would not be okay, but it's a very top-down process, which is not necessarily what I'm like looking for. I'm looking for like a stronger involvement of the private sector, which is there too, but it's just this kind of project it's a regulatory tool called ZAC, which enables these bigger developments. It's quite top down, and now I found an area which might be perfect for it. That's like out of the periphery, like right at the periphery, but a bit outside, and it's this port area. Like there's a small canal going there, and it's like it's overseeable, but it's part of a bigger project, like the northeast development of Paris. And it's just there that like there's this really up north, there's this one area where I had like similar tingly vibes like in Amsterdam North, because you walk through it and you're just like, this is so random. Like, what is happening? Like, what is this? What is that? Where am I right now? So I just started like talking to people and researching who is involved in like both these kind of areas. I got some really good emails of also like inhabitants and people that have like ateliers in those areas. So I'm going to reach out to them, and I think I'm just going to interview the shit out of the city.
Well, that's fine. I think even as you interview, you'll find like rich sort of directions to go, right? But like it's just sort of starting it. But congrats, that's really good.
I hope it's gonna be good.
Yeah, Annabelle, I messaged her. I'll share my screen. It's like I am like just talking to Anna. Are you procrastinating on Sunday? She's actually working at the library. It looks like, but she's calling it a weekend.
That
She's
is
not
very
supposed
right.
to-
That is
it's
very right.
maybe a fair point. So
Just a normal weekend.
yeah. Well,
Yes.
anyway,
How are you doing?
good.
Are you in
Good.
Amsterdam?
Yeah, I'm in Amsterdam. I'm in a WeWork right now, but yeah, I'm in Amsterdam. I've been pretty busy, but I almost finished one paper on like a planning theory paper that I've been working on for a while, and then our book is still getting like a lot closer, so that's good.
That's amazing.
So yeah, the same old, same old. Still not done with the PhD. It's like it feels like it's forever.
It's
So
okay.
hopefully, yeah, no, I'll finish soon. But it's going okay. I've just been quite busy, so but it's good. I feel like I'm making progress through the busyness.
That's good. Did you have a summer break like after?
Not really. It was sort of a little. I went back to the US, and my sister, she's pregnant, and she's gonna be having a baby in November, so I'll be heading back in November. So like I need to book some flights, but in like 15 days or so.
Well, I bet you're gonna find some loophole and just
Yeah, probably. Well, it's not bad because I do have some points, so I could just book it when I know it. I sort of don't want to be there like too soon before, and I think she wants also a little bit of time right after the baby's born to like, repose and not have a bunch of family. But I'll talk to her as it gets closer.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say beforehand, probably, or at least that's how I experienced it from friends. Some are very like protective, depending on also like how that birth goes, because if that is like you can't really plan it. But
well, anyway, we'll see. Maybe we should talk about these questions. The question though, or we're gonna get in trouble when we go back in the main group. Thoughts about peripheral governance?
I'm still confused. I mean, I feel like periphery, just the topic of peripheries is just where do they start and where do they end?
And then you could also like say margins, right? Because I think that was used in like some of the presentations versus periphery. I think there's a definitional question.
But then a margin is always also like an in-between. I feel like for me, a margin is something that like, well, maybe connects places also because it's like the border. And I liked Ebru just going like, well, I mean, the example she brought was like, it's like it can be a peripheral like concept or something that emerge in the peripheries, but then it kind of dislocates and can go like it's not necessarily bound to margins. But then also periphery has margins again, I feel like. So yeah, it's
what do you think peripheral or like the periphery gives us? Does it give us any like analytical use to be talking about peripheral?
Well, I just, so my very personal experience right now is well, the periphery that we literally call periphery here. It's just a big topic because you have these doors that are like really a huge they call them portes, so it's like an actual door in and out from the periphery, and you have like Porte Montreuil, Porte Chapelle, and I think it's an interesting.
But it's a transit oriented type of.
Yes, it's literally just like where a crashing area of like traffic in and out in like a 90-degree angle, like a cross of just traffic that is happening. And then also I feel like it's been very trendy, like in academia or like at least in the urban things, to like look at the peripheries, which I think is an interesting thing, but I'm always a bit skeptic when someone goes to like when I was looking for cases, one of the professors was like, no, you should take this case like it's outside, like it's periphery, like your professor's gonna love it. And
like it's almost like a buzzword in a way.
Yeah, it's like the hipster, like don't look at the center, like look at the outside.
So I think there's a definitional thing. Do you think a periphery is distinct in any way other than its buzzword? Like, is there anything do you think there is actually something distinct about peripheries?
I think maybe it's that extension part, like it's not, or this in between part where it's like it's clearly there, it's part of the city, it's like it melts into it, but there's also this other side of it that literally like kind of implies that the other border that does not belong to the city goes into nowhere, like because it's the border, right?
It's difficult. I don't know. This whole entire like periphery type of terminology, like there's a lot of like urban studies literature on like seeing through peripheries to like understand different processes.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
would you say is the periphery in Amsterdam? Like what would be a peripheral area?
I think it's so difficult. Like periphery. Something I don't want to be like, oh, I don't believe in labels type of thing.
Yeah.
But like, you know, if you look at processes within distinct places, like I don't think the periphery here is comparable to the periphery anywhere else. You know, but it rather like the underlying interactions between actors and that are distinct in a lot of contexts. You know, and this is why like your whole comparison thing and like urban studies and the comparison thing bothers me, right? Because we have a tendency to like want to compare, want to like round up like these three different contexts and say something, but I think they all have very distinct type of relationships, you know, and like different regulatory landscapes, different actor landscapes. You know, I wrote like in the like, especially the first presentation, I thought like the peripheral could be a space where you can like maybe see the private market a little bit different than the non-periphery, but like, you know, that's maybe not necessarily the case either. You know what I mean? It's just like a general statement that we're making about peripheries. I don't know. I find it all very difficult to A, define like you say, and then B, like what its analytical use is within scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just not drinking the Kool-Aid enough.
I was thinking of two things when you were talking. Like one was I feel like Tuna has mentioned that like let's say smaller municipalities, they're so like not well like set up with strategic, like also I think someone else mentioned it, like strategic
like capacity.
Yeah, they don't have the capacities, so they tend to maybe work, maybe I don't want to generalize, but some of them might like work differently compared to like this big setup of a municipality like way closer.
Yeah, Monica also mentioned like with that national housing, Tania, I don't know why I said Monica.
Yes.
Like, yeah, that's, you remembered like a lot of them didn't even know about the policy.
Yes. That's the federal system where you're like, which is super interesting. I never thought about it.
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, would you say you're doing research on the peripheries?
I don't know. I think Amsterdam North is a very interesting example because like just like by line, it's so freaking close to like the main station and the
but if you ask like someone who lives in central, whether
they're like no, it's north.
Yeah, it's the peripheral in their geographical mind, or like even the field, like even where Tuna lives, she lives, you know, right on like south of the ring, you know, and someone would say that's like a geographical peripheral.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good distinction where there is maybe a geographical sense, and then but
then Ebru comes with like that it's peripheral. Yeah, it's
true.
I just think it's difficult to generalize peripherals. Maybe that's just my point.
Yeah, I was here in Amsterdam, so like these projects, which I find is interesting. We had this course on metropolitan governance. We've been looking at like comparing what is like defined, it's very planning oriented. What is a defined metropolitan area? What are the systems? Like here in Paris, it's the Métropole Grand Paris. But then they also define, for example, a functioning zone, and that functioning zone includes all municipalities that I think more than 15% of the inhabitants commute to like the metropolitan, like the Paris like area. And that is obviously like way bigger. And then we were discussing like what kind of setup would one need? And here I feel like there's so many tools. Like this Northeast thing is called, like they founded like this Est Ensemble. So it's like a group of municipalities that are kind of doing something together, and they create these new things. And some of them are, the one I'm looking at is probably what one would say peripheral, but some of them go into like way more central.
Yeah.
A way more central.
What I feel like this peripheral is almost used, like that's why I keep going back to like market actors, or like it's almost seen as like we can only understand the peripheral like if we just had a vision of the world that was only, do you need to understand like market state interactions to understand where the peripheral exists, or do you just need geography? What do you need to understand peripheral? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, because we have a definitional problem, I think, with peripheralness. I don't know. It's all very difficult for me. This is like the landmark, I don't know, in advanced urban studies, if they started with like the landmark debates or urban debates, like the landmark debates in urban studies. And like a lot of people would say it's, I wouldn't say like the post-colonial debate right now, but like there's this debate about the generality of urban topics and then how you approach urban spaces. Like, do you approach it through the particular, or like, are you able to sort of generalize urban theory?
Yes.
And I'm afraid that some of this peripheral scholarship tries to almost approach it through the particular, yet generalize at the same time, which I think is actually maybe not the best position to be when you're theorizing.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah,
but
then
these
also
might all be too strong if they get for the bigger group.
No, I think it's a very good point. I think from the examples they brought, which were so like diverse, it, on one hand it showcased the interesting, or the interesting discussion that can emerge through trying to find similarities or something, like a concept, try to find the concept in different contexts, which is super interesting. But it also showcased the difficulty of finding it, or like, because it was
I wish they would have done a presentation afterwards about like the similarities and differences. I think that's a okay. I think that's good enough. Functioning and what factors affect the functioning and transformation of the current peripheral urban governance context?
Yeah, thank God you wrote that down in the chat. I don't know. I
don't remember. It's hard to answer that question, but I think we could say, like, we talked about the definition of margin and periphery and compared, I like your context, the periphery in Paris, and then like also in Amsterdam. I don't really have any specific strong point of view.
Yeah, it's not necessarily like just factors that affect it, but it's like factors that make it, because depending on the factor or the lens you look at it through, it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, what makes it could actually be what affects its transformation.
Because like from a political view, from a political view, it's a very different thing compared to a geographical one.
But it affects its transformation. I like that.
Yeah.
You just use its definition to
We're just asking more questions.
There we go. That's the good academic way.
That's how it works.
Okay. Should we leave the breakout room? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
See you soon.
Yeah, now everyone is here.
João, by the way, would you mind to moderate this roundtable discussion together with you, João?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
okay.
And who else? I didn't get it. Sorry.
Yeah, I was supposed to do that, but it's a bit tricky with Tina. Sorry.
That's why I said, yeah.
So, okay, I think How many breakout rooms you had, Ebru?
6 in total.
6 in total.
Yeah.
So we might go one after another. Maybe one person of the breakout room can give like a wrap up of the main discussions.
Yeah,
Does it sound good?
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Who wants to start? I don't know, Nagua or Marian?
Maybe group 1. Which one was group 1?
Oh, that's a perfect idea.
Gumesh and I think. You want to go?
No. Sorry, just
Okay, you can fill in.
Right.
So first we talked about what periphery actually means. I mean, you shared your views, but we were still a little bit confused how it would intersect with informality. So I think the way we understood it from your presentation was that periphery can be any area that lags behind, and it doesn't have to be in the periphery of an urban center, but it can also actually be an area that is close by a center or even in a center, so that it might be more about the process of being slightly neglected and having a lot of informality going on. So that was a bit of our understanding, but we're very happy to discuss it. And then we looked at our own examples. So Gumesh shared a bit from Istanbul and I shared a bit from Amsterdam. And we tried to find common factors. And I think we ended up having 3. Oh yeah, and in terms of the periphery, I think Gumesh really said it nicely. She said probably it's best to understand it as the periphery of attention. So we were thinking if there's areas or processes that just don't receive as much attention as others. And we came to the conclusion that one of the key factors is entrepreneurial governance. So just this entrepreneurial way of making decisions. And we could see it in both our example cities. The second point was the flexible planning. And I think that also came out in all the presentations. So growing flexibility and how that flexibility gives more power to a number of dominant actors. And it depends on a case-by-case basis who these actors are. And the last point we found really interesting is this notion of over-regulating and bureaucracy. So planning becomes more flexible. It gives a lot of opportunities to certain actors, but at the same time, there's more and more regulation. But it doesn't mean things are regulated, but actually they lead to more informality, more options. And if, I don't know, a community wants to start something, they are faced with a heavy load of bureaucracy to even get something done, while maybe someone with good connections to the central government can get a project off the ground very fast. So unless I forgot something, that was a brief discussion.
That's great. Thanks very much. I think there are many points there that we can come back later. I will now invite Anita, which was on the second room. Is that right?
Yes.
Thanks, Ebru,
Yeah.
for putting it together. Yeah.
Yeah, this is also for everybody, like to get prepared to the talk.
Yeah, good. Tania, would you?
Yeah, you want to start?
Okay.
Or, yes.
Yeah. In our discussion, we talk about periphery governance, and especially in the Indonesian case. In Indonesia, I talked to Tania that I would say that it's kind of like a chaos governance, because sometimes in the Indonesian case, the periphery is the area between 2 municipality or 2 rural agency. They have different land use. Sometimes in the one regions, it's the land use is as a farming area, but in the other, it's as the residential area. So we can say that in that location, there's a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of market-led
development. So we also can say that in that place, we say that the formality in the informality, because we see lots of formal housing development, but in the formal housing development, we can see a lot of gate communities, and then sometimes in one area with surrounding by gates, but then in side by side with the low income urban kampung. So there's a lot of yeah, like I said, chaosity in the arrangement, and we also can say that there's periphery area sounds like neglecting by the municipality or rural agency, because of they tend to more focus to the urban center, and periphery is something that far away, and they do not see or scrutiny that area as much as the urban center. Maybe you want to add something, Tania?
Yes, certainly. It was super interesting to see how the case in Indonesia overlaps with many characteristics of the Mexican case. I will add just one nice discussion about the boundary, and I guess it's very well known in Indonesia and in other cases, but in Indonesia they have this term desa kota for the transition zone between urban and rural, but that zone is a bit of a gray zone, and it's the policies also, from what I understood, are quite flexible in that sense. So that notion of flexibility, we also recognize it in Indonesia. And also that that space is neglected by the state because they don't recognize it, or they don't make policies specifically, from what I understood, for that case, but it's not neglected by the market. So the market is really benefiting from that void in regulation, let's say. So that was really interesting. And just to add up to what Sarah mentioned about the definition of peripheries, I would also add that it's not that is development that is a bit going behind, or a bit behind the rest, but I would say it's developing that happened outside the norm. So and it could be informality, but could also be in legal gaps there are many different ways. But nice to keep that discussion going.
Thanks very much, Anita and Tania. I think now it's Anna and Andre.
Yeah, I'll quickly start, and maybe we'll both share a little something from our conversation. But I think similar to at least Sarah's group, we first had a debate about peripheral and margin and sort of our definition of the concepts. And in doing that, we brought up the different contexts that we're a little familiar with, but we brought it back to sort of the question that you posed, essentially thinking about how like transformation, or how the current peripheral landscape responds to transformation, and how, watching all three of your presentations, I think you all approach the periphery in different ways. And what we sort of agreed on, I think, to an extent, was the way that you define, or the way that you see a periphery actually is quite instrumental in how it affects change, or how it transforms. So the definitional concepts actually sort of shape the outcomes. So if you see the peripheral as a space, like Tania just said, where there's something outside the norms, or there's certain infrastructure that's different, that's actually going to, in effect, affect its transformation. So sort of turning the definition that you use to define peripheral to sort of say how the transformation could be affected. So I think that's sort of what we came up with in answer to the question. But what I really wish there was a presentation that combined all of your presentations with a bit of another definition too, because I thought all the perspectives were so nice, but to sort of synthesize it would have been really interesting, and maybe a future presentation. I don't know if Anna has anything else to add from the conversation.
No, I agree. Like the beginning of our discussion was about it, like a peripheral area being like a boundary, or like an end or a margin of something. And if you think of it from maybe a map perspective, even like where does it end where does it even start? Like the whole question of defining it or how to use the word per se, and to the question of what factors affect the functioning and transformation of the current peripheral urban governance contexts you experience. I think it was also that depending on how you look, or from what perspective you look at the definition of a periphery, it might be very different. So a political perspective might see something else than an economic or a geographical viewpoint.
Thanks very much, Anna. Andre, I think now it's our group. Champaka, do you want to start? And
Sure. Thanks, João. We had a very interesting discussion. We started with the questions about what regularization means for the different contexts. And I shared some insights on what regularization means for Bangalore, for instance, which has some similarities, but not entirely. And João explained much more, again, sort of reiterated what it means for the Brazilian context. And then then I had another question on, whether the processes of transformation in Brazil are can be read as regulatory capture, or is it market-led development? Is it like really forceful markets which are, taking over the nature of development and regulation since it's a national level sort of a process which is now prevailing in Brazil? Can it be thought about as a much more, forceful regulatory capture? So these were two bigger questions. So João explained to me that regularization in the Brazilian context is driven by the national government. So there's this big transformation that's taking place, which is quite different from that in Bangalore, where land and development in the peri-urban area is still controlled by the state government. Regularization in the Brazilian context here means security of tenure at the individual parcel levels. Previously, it was multiple processes which were coming together, multiple processes of informalization of urbanization, which came together in the past. But now that's kind of becoming much more insular in as tenure for every parcel of land, security of tenure for every parcel of land. And he also clarified that it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily to say that the earlier processes were good or bad, but it's just that it's a different kind of a process, and it's also greater forms of centralization in a way. In Bangalore, on the other hand, regularization is a phenomenon which is supported by all political governments, all political parties, which have controlled the state of Karnataka, which Bangalore is the capital of. And regularization is essentially about violations, regularization of violations. And in the peri-urban areas where violations generally are in the form of conversion of agricultural land to non-agricultural land without permissions, there are multiple forms of violations that take place there. Regularization is supported by the revenue department. So there's a generation of revenues which are supported through this regularization process in the peri-urban areas. In the city center, now master plans exist, but pretty much 90% of our city has some level of violation. Every building has some level of violation. So those are regularized as well. And there are revenues which are brought into the municipal corporation. So there's, deep embedding of both local governments politically as well as from the real estate side and small parcel owners. And likewise, in the peri-urban areas, it's large businesses like real estate investment trusts, for instance, or IT sector campuses, which take over these huge, they amalgamate large parcels of land. But then there is this parasitic, informalized forms of development that sort of get attached to these bigger parcels of land. And there's quite a variety in the nature of informalized developments that come up in the peri-urban areas. João, would you like to add?
Thanks very much, Champaka. I just want to try to put maybe 4 or 5 conditions that have come across our conversation and trying to answer these questions and when we are comparing Brazil in India. The first one will be the changing nature of the agrarian question and the role it plays on how urban areas are expanding. Also the question of centralization or devolution, which is very different in both countries. If major regulatory changes have been happening or going on in the national level or not. Also, this last point to mention on the political economic interests behind urban growth and also on regularization. And also the recognition that informality has many shades and forms, right? Different forms of informality. And sometimes the process of land regularization is tricky because it tries to put everything into just one frame and it doesn't work exactly as that. But I will leave it at that. Let me see. So now we have Mariam and Shan.
Yep. I mean, I'm happy to start, Miriam. I mean, whatever you like.
Yeah.
I think for us, full disclosure up front is we both are focused on property markets, like both for our work and our research. So I mean, I think our first immediate response, both of us, was we have very little experience with this concept, or very little direct experience with it. And thus this in itself was very much like an educational process to learn. And to be quite honest, and I'm probably going to embarrass myself, I'm not sure I understood the question until all three presentations were complete. And then I could kind of wrap my head around like what we're talking through, I hope, and really what we're discussing. And with that said, I think our first immediate thought when it talks about like this idea of the urban periphery had to do with what further defines it. And we actually did look at that in more of a physical sense. And the first idea I think that we really resonated with, Tania, probably had to do with what you were mentioning as far as like an urban growth boundary. And for us, that first example wasn't so much your presentation, but from Andre's home state in Oregon, which jumps out at me as Portland's urban growth boundary. And we had some conversation around that, specifically that the very legislation that has established or somehow defined in order to protect or resolve otherwise this idea of peripheral issue may very well have just exacerbated the issue in a whole different way by then creating like almost like a false market within that boundary and driving up housing prices, and then essentially relocating more people from that urban area where you're supposed to be protecting the growth boundary or protecting natural resources, and you end up creating a bigger problem, and thus people have to move elsewhere and start over again. So that was kind of one of the big takeaways that we had, which is that perhaps responses to or ways to manage certain types of urban growth actually just make a bigger problem or the same problem worse in a different way. So that was kind of our first takeaway. And then I think our next one, and I want to be very careful how I say this, because I think it's politically charged and whatnot, but there are similarities we felt with the way that certain governments manage or don't manage kind of do-it-yourself independent housing efforts on a urban periphery, and the way they treat or don't treat the issue of housing or lack of housing and homelessness in a city center. And I'm not equating the two. I'm not saying that informal housing is homelessness at all. And I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that, but what I did see similarities there are that a lack of government support, a lack of government organization or influence or focus on both of these housing issues in very different areas can create bigger problems that lead residents to figure out ways to solve them themselves. And that seemed to be the narrative there, being lack of focus, lack of support, lack of funding, lack of something that would help shape both of these issues on a housing level, whether it's at the urban periphery or at the urban core. And I guess to Sarah's point, the urban core can be the urban periphery. And I think depending on where the urban context grows, what is the periphery becomes the core. So again, there were similarities there, but I just want to be very sensitive because I think these are very different topics. Sorry, Miriam.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I just maybe I wanted to add there was a case study I came across today. This town in the UK called Hastings, and it was like a tourist town, and it's like an interesting but opposite parallel to the case João shared, with that like leisure township, in that the town is like on the verge of bankruptcy because of the homelessness problem. So it used to be this kind of like, I guess, vibrant tourist destination, but now there just isn't enough state support, or the state actually can't afford like to provide enough social services for homelessness or everything. So it's now on the verge of bankruptcy. And it's like interesting that like one part of society is like becoming more and more dependent on like state support or market support. But then the state doesn't have enough resources. So it's like kind of like areas like how Sean suggested, maybe they were core before, but now they're becoming peripheral. So yeah. And that was
Great.
it for me.
Thank you very much, Mary and Sean, and for bringing this up. And now, last but not least, Nagwa and Ebru. And then after that, we try to give a very brief wrap up, because we don't want to, cross the line of over our time here.
Ebru, shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to keep this super short because it just extends to what Sarah was saying, and how we kind of approached like peripheral governance is from the perspective of informality that Tania was talking about. And in the case of Amsterdam, for example, we've been really looking into the informalities that are kind of occurring due to the increase in regulations that also and flexibility that Sarah was talking about. And what happens is that in Amsterdam, there's a lot of regulation, and mostly non-binding regulations that are occurring to try and regulate. And it's really not working out very well for them, because at the end of the day, they would have certain targets or certain objectives, and they cannot really achieve that, partially due to all these increasing regulations. And this all comes back to the whole topic of entrepreneurial governance and flexibility, and sort of, how do we deal with such informalities, especially under such a complex landscape. So I'm just gonna leave it to that.
Yeah, actually, I shared all my answers today, but I'm really happy that even in a very limited time, we had chance to hear some experiences from Indonesia, Bangalore, Portland, UK, and depending on where you look at the issue, and depending on the context, of course, you can address the issue through like homelessness, as Sean and Mariam mentioned. But what I could say, I think it's important to discover how this entrepreneurial governance context works, because I mean, it's somehow working all over the world, but in a very different ways. For example, like it's more or less like a state entrepreneurialism in Turkey, and I know also in China. And it's something else like on a municipal level and financialized municipal entrepreneurialism in London, as far as I know, as far as I read some articles. So to my opinion, I mean, this type of governance is working all over the world. So it's really important to know more about it, because it looks like it's beyond these neoliberal policies. And also these flexibilities, that was also something we discussed in an earlier conference. If it is a good thing or if it's a bad thing, I mean, what kind of rooms does it make for like conflicts or overregulation or self-organization? So it's really important. I mean, I also strongly agree with this definitions part. It's really important to define the visions, to define strategies, to define what flexibility means in that context, and also like referring to a concept that NAGWA is working on, the social value issue. It is also very related to the communities, the self-organization capacities of communities. And also beyond this, there are something that I have recently read. It is about like beyond entrepreneurial policies of central level or local level authorities, the citizen herself or himself is being like entrepreneurial entities. So they are trying to be a part of all this process as an individual. So to my opinion, it's also important to discover, to explore this issue as well. Yeah, thank you. That's what I want to say.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ebru. I think you started to give this wrap up and the main takeaway points. Tania, do you want to say a last few words over, related to the general discussion here?
Yes, no, certainly. I was also like Ebru very pleasantly surprised of the discussions and particularly I'm really happy to hear about cases in the global north and south, like across the globe, because usually when you talk about peripheral and then immediately people think about Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, but it's really relevant to bring those concepts and to recognize those concepts also in other parts. And I think throughout the discussion, this is very interesting, this boundary between regulation and flexibility and finding the loopholes in the system, and this can be done by many different actors at different levels, and it can be done in a positive way or in a negative way depending on the perspective. But I'm really happy with all the discussion, and looking forward to keep it going and to know what all these cases that seems super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tania, and also thank all of you, because I think this brief discussion we had exceeded our expectation in terms of very different case studies and very different questions of what we had previously in mind. And that was kind of the idea. We wanted to do this not as a seminar, but more as a workshop, because we want to move this forward and we want to get those ideas. So, for example, questions of what is the periphery is at the core of our discussion. We deliberately didn't want to come here today with a closed conception of what is the periphery, because we know that even it's a native notion in different places. It has different connotations for policymakers, for residents, and also among urban scholars. It has different meanings for urban geographers, urban scholars. So we want to keep it open, and I'm very glad that we came with different ideas about it, like left behind places, peri-urban spaces, places marked by more informal process of land use. So there are those different ideas around the idea of the periphery. But for me, it's especially interesting to think about what is governance in those places that are usually overlooked or understudied. That was the main idea of periphery, at least in my sense here. Like what we're not looking at, what kind of actors, institutional arrangements, and new forms of hybrid governance go beyond this more broad idea of neoliberal, entrepreneurial, state-led. So it's just a way to think more with complexity and heterogeneity about governance arrangements in places that we are not usually associate with this. So that was my main takeaway from all this. I think we had great discussions on regulation, flexibility, questions of the role of different levels of government. It seems to be a very important point in terms of comparison. And I think pretty much that was my main takeaway points from this. I'd like to thank very much Sarah and Andre for all the support they gave us. My colleagues, Tania and Ebru, for joining in this idea of trying to discuss something that was new for most of us, and especially for all of you who are here today and gave us a lot of food for thought. And I mean, we are welcoming more people to join in this discussion.
Wonderful. So I hope there can be a follow-up, and for now, enjoy your weekends. See you next time.
Thank you. Great to see
very
you.
much for
Bye bye.
coming.